one.
Welcome everyone to today's Q&A Zoom on combining forces, how schools can leverage M&A to survive and thrive. We put some thought into this one, and we think that it's going to be very helpful for all organizations looking to move forward. So let's go to our next slide. A little bit about Armanino. What matters most to you is that our purpose is to be the most innovative and entrepreneurial firm that makes a positive impact on the lives of our clients, peoples, and communities. And hopefully you see some of that here. What matters most to you is that we work with over 200 private schools, over 800 nonprofits across the country. And right now you can go to our website. You can also go to NBOA's website as well for the COVID Resource Center. There is a lot up there that all schools should be looking to leverage in this definitely challenging time. We know that there are 4 pillars of crisis management, whether it's controlling cash, getting government aid, managing your people, and managing communications. Those are definitely things that are holding up private schools at this time. And with that said, my name is Dean. I'll be one of your presenters today, and I'll let everyone else do their intros.
And I'm Mike Bolton, a partner with Armanino, a specialist in our nonprofit practice group, and in particular, private education. So happy to be here. I'll share some insights around financial due diligence and things folks can be considering with M&A.
I'm Chad Tu. I'm the founder of LearCollab, which is an organization that helps schools with collaboration, mergers, and acquisitions. Also, I have many years of experience in independent schools and also in higher ed. Including a CFO at an independent school for many years and a founder of a school, both in Los Angeles.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hillen. I'm Vice President of Professional Development and Business Affairs at NBOA, the National Business Officers Association. My background is in independent schools, but I'm also a recovering CPA, a recovering public accountant. So always love partnering with our friends at Armanino. Thanks for having me.
Thank you everyone for joining us. All right, our agenda today, 5 big things to know, talk about some due diligence, who should consider a merger, some unsuspected things that we want to keep on the lookout for, and then lastly, some highlights of things from a legal perspective. So with that said, I think the very first thing is that, and Jennifer and Chad can add a lot on this, but this is always been one of those periphery type of things, right? Jennifer and Chad, like, oh, I don't know. Is this one of those taboo type of words? Maybe give some insight here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that merger and acquisition, well, first of all, it feels very corporate. Independent schools try to differentiate and we are so different, so much more mission oriented. So in that regard, I think it's always felt pretty far off. But, the thought of merging or acquiring, every school stands alone and has a different unique value proposition. So it's hard to even think about something like this as a possibility. But we like this word because the taboo has been evaporating. I think even before the pandemic, people were starting to make bolder strategic business decisions, or at least be willing to enter into some of these conversations, even if it doesn't go through to fruition. And I think the pandemic is only accelerating this being more widely discussed.
Yeah, and merger and acquisition is such a success tool for for-profit businesses. It's the way that they, grow and acquire talent by, expanding it maybe into new territories or into new kind of product lines.
Yeah.
And it is the same thing as like a independent high school that might acquire a secondary or lower school that is expanding a product line. But
right,
for some reason, what Jennifer said is like independent schools, you can always tell them because of their strong streak for independence, but you can't tell them much because they're just so into like the way that they their founding story. And as a school founder, I can totally empathize with that. That it was like, this is the way this is why we exist.
That's right. And there has been wildly successful examples of this in the past. If you go to our next slide here, and that shows exactly, go ahead, Marie, go to our next slide. And here's some very well-known, very large independent schools that have done this very well, right? Right, Chad? People have been there and done that.
Yeah, no, I mean, the greatest thing. It's like Wilmerding in the Bay Area, where it was actually 3 different schools, and that they collaborated for a couple decades before they actually all combined into the one school. And you know, it's interesting, this time that we're going through right now in the economic situation, is that Harvard School for Boys, you know, started around the turn of the last century, and that in the Great Depression in the 1930s, that corporate entity that was the original Harvard School for Boys actually, I think, you know, ceased to exist, and they reincorporated, you know, in the 1930s on their campus that everyone knows now in Studio City. But it wasn't until I think '89 that they combined with Westlake School for Girls. And yeah, they're great success examples. Some of the top name brands across the country, you know, have been you know, the products of mergers at some point in their history.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so with that said, then if people are eliminating the taboo, then, you know, show us some of the why here, Jennifer.
Yeah, happy to. So we all know that the independent school business model has been, let's just say, less than ideal for quite some time. You know, we charge less than it costs. We staff up before we know who's going to enroll. We're in the ultimate people business, which is very expensive. That's not to say it's the wrong decision, because our people are how we deliver our mission. But all of this kind of creates a melting pot for difficult financial situations that schools are now finding themselves in, especially during the pandemic. Some schools have a harder time differentiating themselves in certain markets and so on. So even before the pandemic, we started hearing more buzz around this, like we already discussed. Schools are thinking about expanding their footprints and value propositions, how to remain viable in some cases, streamlining competition or potentially eliminating it, you know, stronger together approach, or the myriad other reasons this became attractive at certain leadership tables. So because we're operating in this increasingly complex and competitive education landscape, smart schools are expanding their horizons when it comes to those bolder strategic business considerations. So bring in the current environment of the pandemic, and that may encourage trustees, heads, and business officers to consider strategies that were once considered off the table. So conversations around mergers have become more proactive than reactive. They're no longer about failure or desperation, but more about thriving and differentiating. Schools exploring any sort of restructure, including a merger or collaboration of some sort, can find this really overwhelming. And I know there are partners out there, you know, Armanino, Chad, other people in similar businesses can support schools through this. So an NBOA certainly isn't seeking to replace that, but there's not a one-size-fits-all guide, or there wasn't before. So we wanted to try to offer schools a place to start. We heard from one school who essentially said, how do we put up our for sale sign without wreaking havoc on our community and you know, having something like this be public before we were ready? Other schools have said, we want to expand. We don't want to offend our neighbor down the street, but we think we could be better together. How do we get there? So that's why we started looking into this a little more, because it really is a strategic business decision, and it's not for every school by any means. And those schools will have to make that decision, but that's the why.
Great, great. So let's go to our next slide, Marie.
Yeah, so because of that, we wanted to offer a starting point, and it is just that. It's a starting point, considerations. It's not a how-to on day one after you've merged. Maybe that's the next collaboration. Maybe we'll get there. But this is the, how do you start even having the conversation? What are the considerations? We already talked about how independent school M&A is so different than corporate M&A. It's much more mission-oriented than about pricing and valuation. There may be more give and take to blend cultures, even if there's a more dominant school, a lot to consider. We wanted to, you know, as the National Association supporting the business side of the house for independent schools, wanted to explore the business perspective in particular. So we have a white paper. It was actually released last fall. I think we were kind of predicting the future without knowing it. We collaborated with Chad as well as Venable and Clifton Larson Allen to explore all the different sort of business considerations from the consultant's perspective. Chad will share a lot more about that today, what he's seen in working with a lot of schools through this, the legal perspective, and the accounting and financial perspective. So this provides insights for leaders who are considering a merger or acquisition to secure a more financially sustainable future. This is how some schools may secure their mission in perpetuity. So school leaders have to decide if this is an advantageous path for them, business strategy-wise. There's so many variables involved, not a one-size-fits-all approach. A lot of important perspectives to consider. So I hope the white paper will be of value to some of you, and we'll go through some of the key takeaways here today, but you can go to the NBOA website and find it. That's it.
All right, Chad. Well, if they're going to think about it, what do they need to think about?
Yeah, no, we are going to hit probably a 30,000 foot discussion today, because this topic is, like Jennifer said, highly individualized on each school, each pairing of schools, and also very detailed. There are a lot of different steps, but so the 5 most important things that I would say that schools should think about, or any nonprofit organization should think about, is that, first of all, a nonprofit merger, a school merger, is really focused on mission. That, in the for-profit world, it's about maximizing profit, maybe moving into a new territory or whatnot. But that for nonprofit entities, and it's about perpetuating your mission, and especially perpetuating your mission now in a changing environment. So how, the trustees their mission is not to maintain the bricks and mortar or the nameplate on their school. The mission is spelled out as educational mission, and it's a public benefit mission. And so they really need to focus on how they can do that. And, but there are financial elements about economies of scale. And, so it's not that it's not financial, but it is also mostly about mission. Also, the nonprofit, number 2, the nonprofit missions need to be collaborative. But usually in a structure, we'll talk maybe a little more about the legal structures. It's generally almost always an acquisition, where this one entity that maybe has more complex financial and asset structure that wants to kind of like try to maintain that. Maybe they have bond debt and things like that that are hard to transfer, that they would acquire the entity that has less complex accounting structure or financial structure, and maybe smaller. But that, you don't want to treat it as an acquisition of like some powerful entity coming in and taking over and rebranding another entity, because what schools are at the base is a community of faculty and of learners, of students, and that you really need to approach this as a collaborative or unification of those communities, the communities of parents and alumni and faculty. And you're really focusing on, you're creating a more robust learning and teaching community through this kind of collaborative mentality. So that's a really important aspect. Number 3, I think I always tell schools they need to start from the inside. To, Socrates says, know thyself, that you have to do a great SWOT analysis, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of your own school and the opportunities and threats that exist in the outside market. And to do it honestly. This is so difficult, because usually it's the head and the trustees that are involved here, and they focus all the time on what's so wonderful about the school that makes it distinctive, and that's great. But you also need to look at, like, where are your weaknesses and where might those be overcome by partnering with another school. Maybe you can cover that weak point, maybe in a curriculum program or a certain geographic area by collaborating with another school. So that's or you can also leverage your strength by combining with another school. So that's an important element, to kind of start with a really clear idea of who you are before you start going out, looking for, a dating partner. 4th is that as you go through this process, it doesn't have to end with a full-on merger. That the great thing in nonprofits is that we have an opportunity to, work together with one another in ways that don't necessarily change our corporate entity. And so there are a lot of different ways that schools find to collaborate with one another that maybe help save costs or improve programs by maybe sharing a Chinese teacher, two schools that have like a half teacher that they can share a teacher. Sharing community or faculty development days so that you can kind of like share that resource and improve that synergy that happens when faculty are all together. Crossover, summer camp or summer break programs. There's facility sharing, bus, route sharing to kind of like reduce costs and offer better service. That some schools, especially if they are different age groups, might offer, reciprocal tuition remission benefits, where the teachers at a high school get remission at the elementary school, and the elementary teachers get remission at the high school, and they kind of like partner that way to help each other build enrollment and connection between the two schools. And sometimes in those environments, it's even smoothing the admission path from the elementary or middle school into a high school, where if you successfully complete the program at a school that is a known feeder school that always has been supplying great students to you, why not make it easier for people to kind of move in? So those are just different ideas on how schools can collaborate. And then the fifth thing is to really, you can take this a step at a time. That I think that you take a step, you assess, and if it looks right, you take another step. And I've actually put together kind of like this gated approach that people ask me, well, what does this whole process look like? How do we know, we're on track, or what should we be thinking of? So this next slide kind of like looks at that in a little bit more detail. That, this gated approach of, first of all, finding a way to organize and initiate discussions. Sometimes that happens organically. Two heads, in different meetings are talking, or board chairs that are, socially, acquainted with each other. Oftentimes it can happen through a knowledgeable intermediary, like Armanino or LearCollab, that we work oftentimes with kind of helping people start the conversation and keep it, confidential. That, the next step, if that goes well, then you really kind of like maybe enter into a non-binding collaboration agreement and do some arm's length due diligence, keeping things extremely confidential, sign a non-disclosure agreement. And then maybe actually build a task force, from each board of only a couple of trustees and the head and the CFO to kind of like start exploring what would it possibly look like while it's still kind of like, secret. And that's where you also then maybe could test the waters with some of these different sharing and collaboration elements of, doing joint programs or even sharing trustees. There's a couple of schools I'm working with where the heads of each school have been the outside educator on the other school's board for several years. And that gave them a great insight into each other's schools. That, things work out well there, then you maybe move it further and take a binding intent to merge agreement that has specific targets and deadlines on moving forward. And that's a time where then you jump into, some deeper due diligence and planning. And I know Mike's going to talk about, some of the important financial elements of that. And then finally, that all goes well and you hit those, deadlines, then you do a close of the transaction. But even then, it doesn't mean that the school, each school has to lose its identity. I have two schools in the East Coast that one is has a faith-based roots, and the other is a highly progressive school that's non-denominational. But they see that they can combine as a single corporate entity, experience a lot of those economies of scale, and still maintain, two different kind of brand positions in the marketplace. So that it doesn't have to be, you don't have to find a partner that's identical to you, but that communication is really important once you become public about this, and be ready to do it when, even when you don't think you're public, but when the word might leak out, that, having a detailed communication strategy and also a strategy on how you're going to build the community between these two, formally separate organizations.
Great, Chad. That sounds very, very, very helpful to kind of lay that out. so people don't have to try to recreate this wheel on their own, for sure. Our next slide talks about some of our focus areas and what do we want to do. Is there anything that we need to highlight here?
Yeah, just the most important things, that will come up. And sometimes these can be, a little, difficult to raise, is you're going to end up having to divvy up redundant roles if you bring the two schools together. So you're only going to have one head. Sometimes the head of maybe the smaller school becomes the division head of that institution, especially if it stays a separate location. But that those are questions to answer. You ask, especially now where people seem like they have, like suddenly COVID has given everybody like an extra job about like reinventing two different models, and they still have to do the old job that they had. Do you have the bench strength to be able to carry this out? And if it shows that there are, if it's really promising, then do you have some resources to maybe bring in, not only the legal services, but maybe a third-party consultant who can help coordinate the process, which is what LearCollab does, and that also make sure that you can access the additional accounting help that you need through resources like your professional like Armanino to come and help. But the key last things, I think that the process really kind of determines what the outcome is. As you go through these multiple steps, that's how you kind of feel your way. People say like, well, here, what's the end goal? And it's like, you can't know. You have to kind of go through this and see. You don't start with the goal and force your school and the other school to fit those steps. Going back to what Jennifer said about it, every school is unique, and that we are in a people business. So that's the key thing, community.
That's right. That's why everybody loves their private schools, for that sense of community. And so you have to fight to maintain it, right? And that's probably going to be where a lot of the work is. Okay. So when you look at the financial side of things, Mike, obviously community and communication and figuring out a lot of the logistics is going to be key, but there's going to be some financial things that we're going to need to look at. Mike, maybe you can give us some insight here.
Yeah, really critical part of the overall process. If you think of the timeline maybe that Jennifer and Chad talked about, your missions are aligned, 30,000 foot level, you see the benefits of doing this potential transaction, merger of whatever structure it is. The due diligence process, and particularly the financial side, is really the next step of deciding, is this a go or no go? Or is this a go and we at least know what we're inheriting? And that might be the biggest takeaway from the financial due diligence aspect is you do some fact finding, you know what you're going to inherit, and you can plan accordingly to deal with potential financial challenges or the enhancements to the greater organization as one. So we'll talk through some of the tactics and things to be looking at. But one aspect that we always feel is really important to include in this phase of the process is people, process, and technology. It's not always just the numbers. But you should be assessing the individual people within the business office, their detailed processes, the technology solutions they use. Again, getting those facts to understand how much integration there may need to happen between the two schools, how much enhancements to the technology solutions will be needed, and understanding those challenges that may be coming up. So where are we going to look? Some specific things that might be analyzed during a financial due diligence process, whether it's done internally by the school or by outsiders. First and foremost is the immediate expenses coming up. And I think Chad alluded to this a little bit, but the actual transaction itself isn't necessarily free or without cost. Lawyer fees happen, obviously, but there's some other costs that need to be considered. Facilities. Are you going to be relocating? Are you going to be remodeling facilities? Disposing of assets, those IT conversions? Do you need to increase the number of user licenses on a system, or transitioning from on-premise technology to web-based technology? These are the things you have to start budgeting for in the immediate short term. And one that sometimes isn't thought about is brand management. Are you going to be changing the brand of the school, or do you need to educate a new part of your community about what this combined entity will look like moving forward? And that has some costs as well. So those aside, maybe the more traditional financial due diligence analysis looks at past results. financial results, the past trends, obviously enrollment trends, tuition trends, but what about your financial aid trends, your operating gap trends, cash flow, annual giving? Where has that target school that you're looking at been trending over the recent years? And again, are you going to help enhance them, or do you have to deal with some challenges until you turn a corner as a combined school moving forward? And then outside of those past results, what about the most immediate financial position of that target school? What's their liquidity? Do they have debt obligations? Do they have significant uncollected tuition that you need to go decide what are you going to do with that? Are you going to pursue it, or are you going to let it go and move forward as the new school combined? And then maybe the last aspect that I always feel is really telling when you do financial due diligence is the budgeting process. Again, if you're the school looking at a target school, get a good understanding of how well they budget in the past. Are they accurate, or do they budget and their actuals are way off base? And if they are, again, now moving forward, you may need to do some additional fact gathering so that you can budget accurately as the new combined school for the next year.
Well, and Jennifer and Chad, how many models do we think that people need to run here? You know what I mean? Like, what are some insight we can provide here?
Chad, you're muted, but I'd love to hear what you're going to say.
No, that's really great question, Dean, because you don't want to run a Monte Carlo simulation with a million different variables, but and a lot of times that as you get to the point, you need to make a decision rather quickly to know. But this happens in the for-profit world too in M&A, is that you make your best. You take into consideration and try not to miss any of these great things that Mike mentioned, and do your best. That right now, on top of all of these important elements, that you have the unknown about how is your enrollment going to be impacted next fall, and the associated revenue.
And Chad, I would also expect that, you maybe want to not just 1 year, but maybe a 1, a 3, roll this thing out a little bit and say, hey, it might take some time, but we see the future benefits looking like this.
Exactly. And that's especially where the economies of scale come in, that sometimes those one-time transaction or relocation costs can kind of eat up some of the benefits, the cost benefits in the first year or so, but that they really seem to kick in in the second and third year. When the cost savings of facilities, and Mike mentioned maybe you have to add licenses, but you're also shedding a separate contract, and you're unifying copier leases, and you have a broader census of employees on your benefit plans, and so you're able to negotiate better rates. So there are all kinds of things that kind of kick in incrementally as you go through renegotiations and resettle some things that are not immediate. So it's a great point, Dean.
Yeah, I think that schools really have to have the long view in mind here, because everything Chad just mentioned, he's exactly right. And that takes a lot of time and potentially some upfront cost, hopefully for savings and a win in the long run. So I agree, you don't want a million different financial models, but you do have to really dig under every rock and try to figure out all the different scenarios that could happen. A lot of one-time costs, a lot of capital costs, some things to consider with leadership and staff changes like we've already talked about. And then after you're through all of that, model what the steady future looks like, to the extent that you can even predict that, which we're learning these days you can't. You've got to think about different debt obligations, assets, the donor environment around all of this. That plays into the culture certainly, but also financial sustainability, the culture around reserves and budgeting at the schools, what exposure they may have to liability, just lots of considerations that play into these models. So it takes some time, but they need to put the time into it to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, and I completely agree, and it segues right into our next slide around the modeling. I'm a huge proponent of not only modeling just to know what you're getting into, but modeling to get buy-in from all the stakeholders, and maybe both the schools and the task force that have been put together to pursue this potential deal. Maybe it's 3 models, right? Maybe it's an aggressive, a conservative, and a most likely outcome. Or maybe it's 5 models. But the point being, you're prepared for any possible outcome, whether it's a drop in expenses or a drop in enrollment temporarily. such that no one's surprised and everyone's comfortable with the outer boundaries of those scenarios. So you have some flexibility to work in with, because the last thing you want to do, and I think what most people get scared about in pursuing something like this is, well, what if something happens that we just can't control, and we don't know what'll happen? Enrollment just drops like crazy because of a new brand of the school. Well, if you incorporate that in your models and you can adapt to it, everyone's on board, no one's surprised by it, and you can move forward strongly. Same thing goes with, again, on the people, process, technology. That all bakes in, and some of the assumptions that could be put into those models of the increase in the expenditures on the technology side, or or do you have two business offices from two schools? Are you going to keep it that way, or do you combine them and restructure it? And you can model out the different scenarios based on the salaries and all the related headcount. And so a lot of work to do up front, but it pays off in the back end, just like any concept of budgeting and forecasting that's beneficial there. And we can move to the next one, which nobody's favorite topic, but taxes. Tax exempt organizations, yes, but as we all know, there's some hidden scary items in tax. There's some potential consequences for independent schools, and always something that should be considered when doing financial due diligence. Again, knowing what you're inheriting, the other school's tax risks and exposures become yours. So you need to know what's out there. So some real quick wins that you can do: examining their current status, their state attorney general status, their federal status, review their 990s, their state filings. Always great to pass that off to your own tax CPA. They can take a quick look at them, see if there's something that's missing that would need to get freshened up moving forward. And maybe the greatest risk and exposure is on UBI, unrelated business income. Even if you know that target school, that other school, has no unrelated business income, understand if they've taken positions to say that it's not UBI, and would you agree with that? Because maybe you both have the same fact pattern, but you came to a different conclusion, because we all know this is it's a highly judgmental topic. So you want to be sure you're comfortable with their position, not be surprised by it after the fact. A couple other real quick tax topics that are maybe more rare, but could cause some hiccups down the road. Employment issues, right? Again, do you have the same conclusions on employee versus contractor within your employment base? Property taxes usually exempt, but making sure that they have those exemptions in place, or if not, they're current on those payments. Deferred comp plans is an interesting one. Make sure you know if they have deferred comp plans, you know about them, and you're willing to A, inherit them, and B, if you do, is there going to be a big payout in the future? And if there is, make sure your tax professionals know about that. It can trigger excessive comp excise taxes, and you want to plan for that in that modeling scenario. And then lastly, we've talked about some debt obligations. If there is debt on the books, you might need the lender to provide consent to consummate this deal. And of course, you want to make sure the new school combined can meet all the debt covenants and other compliance issues moving forward. Or if you're going to restructure it, you're obviously going to pursue that as well. And then the last slide is after you've done all that financial due diligence and you've gotten comfortable with what you're inheriting, what you're taking moving forward, it's always important to think about how this will be reflected in your financial statements. That's where us, auditors will be looking at as well. A lot of times very simple, but I wanted to give you a heads up that there could be a twist that makes it a little more complex. And really what you want to be aware of is the legal structure that the lawyers put together is not always the same as the accounting outcome, unfortunately. So a merger on paper might be an acquisition when you follow the accounting rules. And the real quick answer, so that you're aware of, if it's a merger in the accounting world, it's really simple. It's called the carryover method. You combine balance sheets, you move forward. Really simple. If it's an acquisition, you have to determine which school is the more dominant, the acquirer, which school is being acquired, and that acquired entity's assets and liabilities get updated to fair value. You might have to recognize intangible assets, so domain names, brand names, if they have significant value, and then you're gonna have goodwill. Like a for-profit, you'll have goodwill, but in the nonprofit world, that's called an inherent contribution. It flows through as income, non-cash, but that'll make your financials look a little different that first year that this occurs. So things to be aware of, making sure, again, the stakeholders know that this will look differently on your financial statements, your board, your audit committee, and so on.
Mike, you just made this sound way more complex than anybody thought it was going to. But I think the big thing is just be talking, right, to all of your partners, and just be out ahead of the curve so that we can do this the right way.
Agreed.
Okay, well, I would love to start this slide by saying, I love what a friend of mine, my dear friend Megan Mann at NAIS, said recently on another program. I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I'm going to take it a step further and say that I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm only a frustrated student of law and not an attorney. So I'm grateful to my friends at all of the great law firms that support independent schools, including in this case Venable, who we worked with to explore the legal perspective of M&A. So thanks to their education, I know enough to be dangerous and give you at least the considerations you need to think about from a legal perspective. And there's a lot more in our white paper, and of course at any outside counsel you may already work with. So terminology, Mike was just talking about this. Terminology was big for us in this conversation, and it was an early sticking point. It was pretty amazing how difficult it was. Chad may recall these conversations for accounting experts, legal experts, tax experts, independent school experts to agree on what a merger is, what is a consolidation, what is an acquisition. So here's where we landed. In a merger, two separate schools can fully integrate their programs, functions, and operations by joining together and continuing as one entity. So generally when schools merge, a merging school becomes part of a continuing school, and the merging school ceases to exist as a separate legal entity. The continuing school takes title to all of the assets, assumes all of the liabilities of the merging school, and the continuing school adopts amended bylaws to reflect a new governance structure that's combined. In a consolidation, each legal entity dissolves and an entirely new nonprofit corporation technically forms. That new corporation takes title to all of the assets and assumes all of the liabilities of both former schools. The new nonprofit corporation establishes brand new bylaws and a totally new governance structure. In an acquisition, one school dissolves and ceases to exist as a separate legal entity, and the other school acquires the dissolving entity's assets. The remaining school is typically shielded from assuming their predecessor's debts and liabilities in this case, which is why this might become attractive. The dissolving school has to follow statutory procedures, and an asset transfer always poses some risk of successor liability. In an alliance, this has been something really interesting that I think, Chad mentioned schools that collaborated for a long time before they officially merged. Alliances are popping up all over the place. They're short of a merger or an acquisition. Schools can consider other kinds of strategic alliances or combinations. They can be a short-term test before you commit to anything, like a full combination, or they can be part of a longer-term plan to work cooperatively without fully integrating operations. So you might have a limited asset purchase or transfer, a joint venture, something of the sort. So I hope that's helpful. It was really helpful to us in sort of outlining our white paper around these terms. So on the next slide, once we got the terminology down, there's a lot more to think about after that. So procedures and documents. So we've covered some of this in a way, but from a legal perspective, at your initial discussions, you've got to think about school representatives involved. Confidentiality and non-disclosure is critical. Schools can create a separate confidentiality agreement like an NDA or include a provision in a non-binding letter of intent. As far as due diligence, as the school's fiduciaries, its trustees and senior administrative leaders will have to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the conditions of any agreement to join forces. The assessment has to be based on careful review of key factors affecting the operations and facilities of the institution, as well as potential legal, governance-related, financial, administrative, and other matters that could create liability exposure. Liability all over the place here. But it's not to be a deterrent. You just need to be thorough. As far as agreement and approval, once schools complete all of this due diligence, Mike walked through a lot of what's important. They decide to move forward. They've got to articulate a plan of merger or consolidation and incorporate those terms into a formal agreement that covers governance and operational issues, including amendments to governing documents. So on the next slide, we dug into employment issues a little bit further because that's huge here. I mentioned at the start of this program that we're in the ultimate people business. So to me, outside of the culture for the whole school community, this might be the trickiest part. So in terms of risk management, both sides should seek disclosure of potential employment claims and risks, including outstanding demand letters, government audits and investigations, existing litigation, any internal complaints of harassment, discrimination, or other unlawful activity. Hopefully you don't find any. And right-sizing faculty and staff, we've already mentioned that an affiliation of any kind really will likely result in redundancies in staffing, especially in key leadership positions and in the business and administrative offices. So this is something to consider. And this is tricky. Our schools are our families, and we've already operated with pretty low faculty and staff to student ratios. Those ratios will only be blown up even further in any sort of combination. So this is hard. This to me is the hardest part, but it's really critical for the long-term financial sustainability of the school. So as far as combining staff, for the employees that will remain, especially if two schools merge or consolidate, schools should review all employee policies, pay practices, procedures, benefit plans, decide how to implement new policies or continue with existing plans. Mike mentioned this earlier, but what if schools have different interpretations of FLSA for similar positions, for example? So those are all the things you need to walk through and get on the same page about. So that is the extent of my legal expertise today. I'll bone up for our next program.
For not being a lawyer, that was really good, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we've talked about some of the financial side. We've talked about, the big 30,000 feet, then financial. Jennifer did her attorney impersonation. What are some things that we might not be seeing here, Chad?
Yeah, I just want to throw out like a couple of potential pitfalls, or unexpected dangers. And certainly, I mean, we talked about the importance of confidentiality and what happens if there's a breach of that. I was involved. One of my earliest experiences when I came on to be a CFO of a school, they were just completing the acquisition of a neighboring school, but that acquisition was actually queued up 3 years earlier. And they went through many of the beginning steps, but in the due diligence, they found out that there were some issues that needed to be cured that before they could proceed with the transaction, and that took a couple years. They were about kind of permitting on the campus that was being acquired, and but the word got out that in that earliest transaction that there was a potential acquisition happening, and it caused all kinds of havoc, especially in that acquisition, the school that was being acquired. And so their enrollment, suffered a little bit, and people were uncertain, and it created a lot of, unnecessary, mistrust or difficulty. So that's just one thing. Make sure that you keep confidentiality, up front and center. And also, at the same time, each head should have in their back pocket, a statement in case suddenly the confidentiality gets breached. And the other kind of related to this too is the hubris. Sometimes there is a school that is struggling and another school that's in a stronger position. And it gets back to this idea about collaboration and bringing together two communities. Is that sometimes, especially it would happen sometimes with trustees, that they feel very confident and they love their school so much that they don't want to budge on anything, that no, it's going to be our way, and we're acquiring you. And that when you don't, when you're too prideful in kind of like that coming together from one school to the next, it can blow up a deal. It poisons that chance to kind of like create the collaborative community and bring, faculty and parents and students together. And also sometimes in an experience I was involved with in New York, that an announced merger blew apart and never happened because the school that was being kind of acquired was able to raise money from alumni just because the other school was kind of like too heavy-handed. So, these are a couple things to watch out for.
Okay, very insightful there.
The most important thing on the next slide is, so given all this, it's difficult, there are a lot of things to be paying attention to. There's these, potential dangers. Should we even be considering it? Well, I say yes. I think every school should be at least considering some kind of collaboration, that we are in a world that COVID has thrown us into a lot of new difficulties, but even coming into this before this pandemic, that we had a declining birth rate, increasing competition, that schools needed to look for a new business model and a new way of moving forward, and that considering how you can collaborate with one another, or even up to a potential merge, is very legitimate. Hopefully that taboo is kind of like washed away. And this is not just for a weaker school. Strong schools that I'm working with right now, are looking at kind of like a hub and spoke model, where a strong K-12 school might acquire or merge with a couple of elementary schools that are on their periphery territory to create a larger presence in their community. And and certainly schools that are in areas where the demand is declining, that it makes perfect sense to kind of like come together and have one business office, one advancement office, one administration, even if you continue to have two locations and with different service missions. So,
and Chad and Jennifer, I mean, we're seeing mergers, discussions, and maybe future announcements happening right now as we speak, and I would say all across the country. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, definitely. We're doing a lot of check-ins with some of the local, state, regional associations, and I'm hearing from those executive directors, especially those who are accrediting bodies, that they're working with some of their schools within their associations to consider merging. They're being more proactive than reactive, which I think is good. We said at the start of the call that the pandemic is really accelerating that, but I do know of some schools who are already in the process, and maybe they'll only get through it faster now that there's more of a need. It's out there.
And I'm working with pairs of schools, almost every corner of the country that have aggressive deadlines about trying to come to final determinations before September, because at least being able to announce an intent to merge, a binding intent by September is important, because that's when you're going to be starting to recruit the students for 12 months from then.
Right. So you're saying that if schools are trying to potentially have an announcement in the fall, then all of the things that we just covered here are going to be crucial over the summer. Is that what I'm hearing, right? Is that fair, Chad?
These are often schools that have kind of like been in the process for months, because oftentimes this whole process, ideally it can take, a year at least to kind of like go through in a thoughtful way, especially when everybody else is busy. But I've also, been involved with like a school startup where, we made the decision in March and we were open in September.
Wow. I was going to say maybe the opposite, but that's really encouraging. We have a case study in our white paper where the merger took 3 to 4 years to kind of go from start to finish. And I think it's just totally dependent on every situation. If you can make it happen in a few months, like the example Chad mentioned, amazing. If it takes 3 to 4 years, it's worth powering through in a lot of these cases. And some schools spend years, and at the end of all of this, they decide it's not viable. And that's okay too, as long as they've followed, the really thoughtful conversations, and both leadership teams feel good about the decision that each school will continue on its own, and maybe they revisit it in the future. So a lot of different results to this work that we've seen so far.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. And with that said, we definitely wanted to, encourage anyone to send in any questions that you might have on something that you heard here. And we can wait for those. But momentarily, Mike,